Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's Edwards Lecture. Tonight's lecture features Reverend Dr. Douglas H. Brown Clark. This evening, Dr. Clark will discuss his presentation will focus on African Americans' contribution to the Presbyterian Church USA. Before we get started, just a couple of acknowledgments. The Louisville Seminary Edwards Peacemaking Lectureship honors Dr. George Edwards and his wife, Jean. Dr. Edwards, who died in 2010, served the Louisville Seminary community for 27 years as professor of New Testament. And George and Jean, who died in 2020, they shared a ministry that was active in Christian efforts for peace and justice. And this evening's event is presented by Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary's Black Church Studies program, with funding provided by our Edwards Peacemaking Lectureship, as well as the Lilly Endowment, Inc. Thriving Congregations Initiative. And this is in support of our seminary's Nehemiah project. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Dr. Angela Kauser, and she will have some words and introduce us to our speaker for this evening.
I take great delight in doing that. Thank you very much, Chris. Dr. Clark is a friend and a colleague, and I am delighted to introduce him. The Reverend Dr. Douglas H. Brown Clark is a visiting assistant professor here at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He has taught here for the past 2 years, primarily through courses in our Black Church Studies program, while also serving on the Gender and Ministry Committee and the Black Church Studies Consultation Planning Team. He also teaches church history courses at Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. Dr. Clark is an ordained Presbyterian minister through the Presbytery of Charlotte, where he grew up as a childhood member of both Davidson Presbyterian and Davidson College Presbyterian churches, where he now serves on that Presbytery's anti-racism ministry team. Dr. Clark received his BA from Davidson College and an MDiv from Vanderbilt Divinity School, a PhD also from Vanderbilt University, where he studied Black church history, especially in connection to civil rights, Black power, reparations, and Black Presbyterianism. His current book project, entitled A Solid Black Hyphen, Race, Religion, Identity, and the Black Power Activism of Gayraud S. Wilmore, examines the history of religion in the civil rights and Black power movements, with a particular focus on Black Presbyterian minister, theologian, and activist Gayraud Wilmore. Dr. Clark's research has benefited from support as a research fellow with the Presbyterian Historical Society and as a fellow in Vanderbilt's program in Theology and Practice. It is with great delight and anticipation that I introduce a fellow Presbyterian, Dr. Clark. The floor is yours, sir.
Good evening. Thanks to Dean Kauser for that introduction. Dean Kauser has been my primary mentor here for the past 2 years as a new faculty member here at Louisville Seminary. And so I really appreciate her support as a mentor and a colleague and a friend. Thank you all for tuning in tonight to hear about the history of the Black Presbyterian tradition. I should say at the outset, I'm very aware this is not at all comprehensive or definitive. I will leave some things out, hopefully not too many, so I apologize for that in advance. It feels like just a vast topic to me. There's a lot that I would like to say and discuss with you, but we only have the time that we have. A little further introduction of me. Dean Kauser hit all the high points about my teaching and my scholarship on Gayraud Wilmore. You might have also noticed that I'm a little more light-skinned than you might expect for a speaker on this subject. You know, what's this white guy doing talking here about Black church history, right? That's a fair question. The talk's not about me, but I will give you a little bit of my own backstory to begin because it is relevant. I actually grew up in the Black church. My parents joined a Black Presbyterian church a few years before I was born, Davidson Presbyterian Church. which is not the same as Davidson College Presbyterian Church, the white church, which is 2 blocks away. I tried to measure on Google Maps. It looks like it's about 100 yards, 150 yards apart, separated by Main Street and by railroad tracks. Both wonderful congregations. Some of you may be aware that that area, the Charlotte, North Carolina area, has the largest concentration of Black Presbyterians in the country. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. But I'm a member of that presbytery, and I was just ordained there about a year ago into that presbytery. My parents were idealistic white Southern Presbyterians, both recent seminary graduates who were trying to make an anti-racist choice in terms of church membership. My mother, who's a hospital chaplain, preached from that church's pulpit many times, especially during an extended period when the church was without a full-time pastor. My father served as a trustee for Davidson Presbyterian, and I grew up in that church. The other church members and pastors there are the ones who first taught me about Jesus and the Bible, who taught me my first hymns and spirituals. That's where I first went to Sunday school and vacation Bible school and had my basic formation, my basic Christian education. So they probably said a few things about John Calvin and Reformed theology, but that may have gone over my head at the time. My childhood pastor was Mark Lomax, a Black liberationist who had been a student of Gayraud Wilmore's and is now pastor of First African Presbyterian in Lithonia, Georgia, and a professor at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. And another thing that pretty much went over my head at the time when I was a kid was that many of my fellow church members were dealing with lots of other things that my family didn't have to think about in our day-to-day lives. Things like redlining, mass incarceration, racial profiling, police violence, employment discrimination, school resegregation, economic oppression, just getting pulled over by police, and all the daily hazards involved in being Black in America. So that's how I got into this work. I come from the church. My work is not just for scholars and academics, it is for the church. And by that, I mean the everyday people in the pews, people, many of whom are dealing with all those same challenges today of living in a racist country, as we see even in today's news from Minneapolis. I went on to study Black religious history as well as Black and womanist theologies in college, and then at Vanderbilt for graduate school to continue to study Black church history and to write my dissertation as a biography of Gayraud Wilmore. So, that's the story of how I got here tonight to this topic. I'm not a Black Presbyterian, but Black Presbyterianism is not only something that I'm interested in intellectually, it's a faith tradition that's been really formative for me as a person and as a Christian. So any successes that I have when I write or teach about Black Presbyterianism, credit for that is due to the members of Davidson Presbyterian, though of course any shortcomings are my own entirely. So enough about me. The faith tradition of Black Presbyterianism is what we're talking about tonight. And I just want to flag that first of all. One of the main points I want to make is that Black Presbyterianism is a faith tradition. It's not just Black people who happen to be Presbyterian. Okay, it's a kind of a tradition and ethos in itself. When we talk about Black folks in majority white denominations, people are often surprised to hear that there even are Black Presbyterians. The speaker the other night for United Methodists noted that people have the same question about Black United Methodists. Are there really Black United Methodists? And there's also a really great book out in the past couple of years about Black Catholics. There are a lot of Black Catholics in the United States. So, that's one of the first questions people have. Gayraud Wilmore, who I write about, he's one of the most influential Black Presbyterians of the past century and was also the most important scholar of the history of the tradition. And he had a couple of anecdotes about this. He talked about how he would hear people say that Black Presbyterianism, the term Black Presbyterian was a contradiction, an oxymoron, or that if you run into a Black Presbyterian, somebody has been messing around with their religion. And he also he wrote about how in the 1960s, when the Northern Presbyterians were doing civil rights work in Mississippi, that local people would sometimes refer to them as pedestrians, because they never heard of the idea of a Presbyterian before in that part of Mississippi. So yes, there are Black Presbyterians. And so then the next question might be, why and how are there Black Presbyterians? And obviously we can ask the same about other groups of folks, white Americans, but we're talking about Black Presbyterians right now. And one assumption people might have is that we're talking about a few Black people who wandered into white churches and kind of liked things there and stuck around as kind of a minority within congregations. That's certainly part of who Black Presbyterians are. There are Black people who are members of majority white Presbyterian churches. But most of what I'm talking about tonight, most of the tradition here is centered around Black congregations, historically Black congregations that are a part of a majority white denomination, the Presbyterian Church. And so I'm suggesting that these Black Presbyterian congregations especially have formed a distinct theological tradition within the broader Presbyterian Church. Now, Presbyterianism has never been as popular among Black Americans as Baptist or Methodist traditions. There are a few reasons for this. The early days of the United States, the early 1800s really was the period when a huge percentage of Americans became Christian or became affiliated with churches. And that was true for Black Americans as well as white Americans through what's known as the Second Great Awakening, a series of revivals during that period. Methodists and Baptists were the biggest beneficiaries of these mass revivals because their theology allowed more for the idea that one could choose to become Christian, like to get saved, like through an altar call or something. Whereas Presbyterians were a little nervous about that idea because of things like predestination. They weren't quite sure, they had a more complicated answer to that question. Also, Presbyterians really insisted that all their ministers have a high degree of formal theological education. And in this revival period, that really hampered the growth of Presbyterian churches. There was so much enthusiasm for revival and Christianity and church at this time, and lots of people wanted to join churches or become ministers. And if you were there at that time and you were telling people that you're not really sure about this whole idea that people can get saved through revival, and also people couldn't become a pastor without a whole lot of expensive theological training, or if you're trying to tell a congregation, sorry, we can't send you a pastor because we don't have enough people with seminary degrees, then what happens is a lot of folks will be like, fine, we're not going to be Presbyterian, right? We'll walk over and we'll be Methodist or Baptist instead. And so those are some of the reasons why most Black Christians at that time and continuing well beyond that would become Baptists or Methodists of different sorts. And really, the same is really true for most white Christians in the South. It's similarly rare. It's rare to come across a Black Presbyterian. It's also pretty rare to come across a white Southern Presbyterian, maybe unless you're in like the Louisville area or Charlotte area or something like that. There's one additional reason why not many Black people became Presbyterian in that era. And that was because in the early US, very few white Presbyterians, especially in the South, were anti-slavery. But there were a good many white Baptists who were, and white Methodists as well. The Methodist Episcopal Church had even officially condemned slavery in the 1780s. Now, anti-slavery white folks of any sort really quickly diminished in the South. They went underground, or they kind of switched sides or went up north or something. It wasn't hospitable for that. And white Methodists in particular famously backed really far away from their anti-slavery stance because they realized that it would endanger their standing in the white Southern community, which they cared a lot about. But the Methodist Episcopal Church still had a reputation for a kind of egalitarianism, a kind of equality, so much so that in one of the rebellions of enslaved people, Gabriel's Rebellion in Richmond, Virginia in 1800, it didn't actually take place. It was stopped before it could take place. But part of the plan was the rebels would kill any white people except for Quakers, who were abolitionists, Frenchmen, who were seen as anti-slavery, and Methodists, because the Methodists had this reputation for being anti-slavery. So the point is, there were other groups that could draw Black people, and there was nothing particularly attractive about Presbyterians in this really formative period for American religion for African Americans. On the other hand, there's a couple of reasons why Black people have become Presbyterian or remained Presbyterian after becoming so. And the biggest ones that I see are access to education and a really distinctive prophetic social justice witness. And I'm going to talk a little about the social justice piece first, and I'll come back to the education piece later on. Black Presbyterians have never been large in numbers, but they often have been really distinctive in their witness for social justice. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here to avoid slipping into any kind of denominational rivalry. There's lots of social justice and activism among AME, AME Zion, CME, Black UMC, and other groups, different kinds of Baptists. But I do think there's something distinctive about Black Presbyterians' social witness. Perhaps part of that comes from the way that the Reformed tradition, and it has this idea of the sovereignty of God, which suggests that every part of life is under God's authority. And so every part of life is subject to being reformed. The Lutheran tradition, on the other hand, sometimes has this kind of a sense of the world as being divided into a religious sphere and a political sphere. And so the church maybe doesn't get involved in politics sometimes. The Baptist tradition has a strong sense of separation of church and state, which can sometimes lend itself to that same idea. But Presbyterians are a little bit different, so much so that we sometimes get accused of being a little more theocratic. We don't believe in quite such a big divide between church and state, or at least between religion and politics. Our theology prevents us from saying that, for example, climate change is a political issue, not a religious issue. No, our theology says that every issue is a religious issue and is of concern to the church. And I do kind of wonder if there's a certain parallel here to the belief in certain African worldviews that there's no separation of the sacred and the secular, that all is one. So anyway, there's these resources in the Reformed tradition that call for social justice. So that's the theological piece of this. There's also an organizational piece. And this is something that Black Presbyterians have in common with Black United Methodists and Black Episcopalians. For people in historically Black denominations, like the AME, AME Zion, CME, the creation of a Black denomination in itself was a liberating act, a radical act. And that means that any kind of building up of that institution or expanding of that institution is in itself a form of racial and social justice. But that work takes a lot of energy, and there's only so much time in a day. And it may be that such work sort of takes away from how much energy you put into certain other forms of political activism, perhaps. You know, obviously we could argue about this, right? But for Black members of majority white denominations, some of that I think is not the case. There's less energy that has to be put into like building the denomination. And the expansion of the denomination is not necessarily liberating. In fact, it may be the opposite. And one theory here is that Black members of these majority white denominations are working with white people so often and dealing with inequities in church institutions and in Presbyterian conference meetings and seminaries and different kinds of microaggressions and paternalisms, that they become even more radicalized to oppose white supremacy because they see it up close, even in their fellow Presbyterian ministers, for example. So, I mean, that's kind of a theory. It's pretty debatable, but I think it's worth thinking about. You know, the more time you spend with white people, the more your consciousness is raised about racism and inequities, both within the church and the wider society, and perhaps the more political you become. So whether those kind of hypotheses are true or not, it's certainly true that there were a good number of prominent Black Presbyterian abolitionists in the 1800s. So I'll talk about a few of them next. These included the Reverend Samuel Cornish, who was the editor of the first Black newspaper in the United States, period. He was a founder of a church called the First Colored Presbyterian Church of New York City in 1822. Also includes the Reverend Theodore Wright, who was the first Black person to graduate from a theological seminary in the United States from Princeton in 1828. And he later succeeded Samuel Cornish as pastor of that same church in New York City. These two men worked together to fight against segregation within churches. And Theodore Wright worked on the Underground Railroad to aid people fleeing slavery. And he also fought politically for voting rights in New York State. There were other Black Presbyterian abolitionist ministers in this era. James W.C. Pennington I think he was ordained Congregationalist, but he served a lot of Presbyterian churches, so he's sort of in between. He escaped from slavery and became the first Black student at Yale. And also Henry Highland Garnett. Henry Highland Garnett was the first Black person to speak at the U.S. Capitol building. He had an 1865 sermon address to the House of Representatives on the occasion of Congress's passage of the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. Henry Highland Garnett, especially prior to the Civil War, he was one of the most kind of fire-breathing radical abolitionists of his era. He even made somebody like Frederick Douglass really, really nervous with his radicalism. Henry Highland Garnett gave a famous address at a Black convention in 1843, where he proposed a resolution and openly called for the convention to endorse this resolution to have a nationwide armed rebellion against slavery, a nationwide slave revolt. And Frederick Douglass and some others who were not quite so radical, they fought really hard against Garnett's resolution, and the resolution failed by one vote. So, really important, radical to varying degrees, Black Presbyterian ministers, really well educated, involved in abolition in that era. Now, the Presbyterian Church as a whole, in the Civil War era, like other churches, split over the question of slavery. Baptists and the Methodist Episcopal Church split explicitly over slavery, over the question of whether an enslaver, a slaveholder, could be a bishop or a missionary in those denominations. Presbyterians split in 1837 for more complicated theological reasons, mostly had to do with revival, and not strictly on a north-south basis. So it was kind of a convoluted split. But then in the 1860s, the divisions became much more explicitly about slavery. And there were several different kind of realignments that happened in that decade. But by the end of the war, you basically had two American Presbyterian denominations, one which was anti-slavery Northern Presbyterians, and one which was a pro-slavery, pro-Confederate Southern Presbyterian church, unapologetically racist, even after the Civil War. There were some Southern white Presbyterians who were really prominent theologians at this time, and they distinguished themselves in part by working out theologies to try to justify slavery. One of them, Charles Colcock Jones, was an enslaver from Georgia. He went to seminary up north, and he became, more concerned about slavery and was like, oh, it's not just, what am I going to do about it? And he had this conflict in himself, but he wound up resolving this conflict for himself by deciding that his calling was not to liberate enslaved people, but to evangelize enslaved people, to convert them. And so he set up this major effort to evangelize and preach to and teach enslaved people in Georgia. He decided in his own mind that he could save souls instead of bodies, and that was even more important to him. And I always find his story really, really haunting, because I think he actually did on some level really want to make a difference, but he was so self-deceptive. He let himself believe that he was helping people, but he really wasn't helping people. He was just kind of not. So, and in fact, what he did was he helped give other pro-slavery theologians and politicians some reasons to justify slavery. Slavery had never been about converting enslaved people. In fact, lots of enslavers, slave masters, were totally against any idea of conversion or Christian education among enslaved people. But now these pro-slavery folks had a kind of a big lie that they could tell, to say that slavery really was just all about a benevolent way to civilize and Christianize Black people, which, of course, was not true. Another pro-slavery Southern Presbyterian, James Henley Thornwell, came up with the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, which is the idea that the church should only care about spiritual issues, not social or economic or political issues. In other words, we should care about saving souls, and maybe some personal morality things like gambling and sex and alcohol, but we have nothing to say about social or political things like slavery or racism. And this was all very hypocritical, of course, because they absolutely did support slavery and racism, but they used this idea to say that church people should not speak out against slavery. And this was also totally against what the Reformed tradition had always said, which is that God cares about all issues, and therefore the church should care about all issues. There's not one set of issues that we can set aside as political issues and not worry about them. So this was all kind of nuts. I mean, this is what was going on with all these white Presbyterians at this time. But again, these arguments were mostly between white Presbyterians. So what's going on with Black people, Black Presbyterians in this period? In the South, before the Civil War, as many of you know, most Black people didn't have independent Black congregations. There were a few like Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, but most Black people, if they were Christians before the war, they either attended white-led churches and sat in the balcony, or they attended worship that was led or overseen by enslavers on the plantations, or else they worshiped in secret in the dead of night, where they were free to bring in forms of worship they preferred, and most importantly, to preach and teach the theology in which they believed, which was a liberating anti-slavery theology and biblical interpretation that they could never talk about with white people who were around, at least without using some kind of code language, right? So then what happens after the Civil War is that a lot of these folks, African-American Christians in the South, march out of the balconies of their white-led churches and they walk right down the road to a barn or to somebody's house, and they start their own Black churches there. Or if they were already meeting secretly at night, then they start meeting openly as Black churches in people's homes or in sheds or outside. And some of them were Presbyterian because maybe because they learned something from somebody like Charles Colcock Jones, or because that was the tradition they had been exposed to through their enslavers, or because of Northern missionaries. So a variety of reasons. And similar things, of course, are happening for Black Methodists, Black Baptists, Black Episcopalians, and so forth at the same time. So, like I said, another important piece of this was Northern missionaries. All of these Northern denominations, white Congregationalists, white Methodists, white Baptists, white Presbyterians, or at least majority white groups from the North, and also historically Black denominations like the AME and the AME Zion, they sent all these missionaries into the South right at the end of the Civil War, right after the Civil War, to help organize churches in their denominations among the freemen and free women, the newly freed people. And they also set up lots of schools, everything from grade schools to colleges and seminaries. This is mostly before public schools became a big thing in the South, or about the same time as they were starting to become a big thing. And so this was a time of a lot of the founding of lots of HBCUs, historically Black colleges, by many of these religious groups. And that included some Presbyterian HBCUs, because Presbyterians are super into education and have been, for hundreds of years. So anyway, suddenly there are AME, AME Zion, Black UMC, Black Baptist, and Black Presbyterian churches and schools starting up all over the South. Remember, the majority white denominations most of them are split in two, a North and a South. And so these new Black congregations in the South were affiliated with Northern denominations, Northern Presbyterians, Northern Methodists. That's certainly very much the case for Presbyterians. So as the war comes to the end, you have two denominations for Presbyterians. There's a majority white Northern anti-slavery denomination, and there's a almost all white Southern pro-slavery denomination. But immediately after the war, that starts to change. You still have these two groupings, but the composition changes because within a few years, you still have the one almost all white, still pro-Confederate, pro-segregation Southern Presbyterian Church. But this other denomination that had Northern white and black churches in it now had all these Southern black churches as a part of that denomination. So that means if you went to a presbytery or synod meeting, like a conference meeting in the North, almost everybody in that regional meeting would be white. But if you went to a presbytery or synod meeting in the South in that same denomination, almost everybody there would be black. But then if you walked across the street to a presbytery or synod meeting in the South with the other denomination, the pro-Confederate denomination, everybody there would be white. So that's kind of how that gets set up. The Southern denomination was called the Presbyterian Church U.S. or the PCUS. The Northern and Black denomination, it went through a few different names. There were some minor kind of splits and mergers that happened, but basically it was called the Presbyterian Church U.S.A. or the PCUSA until the 1950s. And after that, it was called the United Presbyterian Church. And I'm mostly going to refer to it as the United Presbyterian Church. So you've got the PCUS in the South and the United Presbyterian Church in the North, and also black churches in the South. Okay, so in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, we have all these Presbyterian missionaries, black and white in the South, building churches and schools. This was also an era of lots of foreign missions, and these included some really important Black Presbyterian contributions to foreign missions. The Northern Church sent lots of Black Presbyterian missionaries, particularly to Africa. There were 57 sent to Liberia just in the 1800s, and others sent to other parts of the world. The Southern Church, the almost all-white PCUS, also, it had some black members. There was a black synod called Snedecor Synod, and they sent some really important black missionaries to Africa as well, particularly to the Belgian Congo. Lucy Gant Shepherd and her husband William Shepherd are the most famous of these. William Shepherd graduated from the Southern Church's only HBCU, Stillman College, in Alabama, and this couple were missionaries in the Belgian Congo. They were the first black missionaries from the PCUS to Africa, and they were really instrumental in really international politics in calling international attention to human rights abuses by the Belgian government in Congo, and helped lead to the end of those abuses by King Leopold. That talks about in The Heart of Darkness, right? So he was really important in that. So, now we get into the 20th century. And when we get into the 20th century, we have to talk a little more about the role of education and social class in Black people embracing Presbyterianism. And I'm going to start this by telling one of my favorite anecdotes about Gayraud Wilmore. Now, some of you may have heard of Gayraud Wilmore. We celebrated him a lot lately at Louisville Seminary. My dissertation is in a sense a sort of a biography of Dr. Wilmore. He's a central figure in the book, and so there's a lot more I could say about him. And I also had the wonderful blessing of being able to interview him in person several times and get to know him for the last 3 or 4 years of his life. He passed away almost exactly 1 year ago, April 18th of last year, at age 98. And I'll talk more about the rest of his life in a minute, but first I want to tell you the curious story of how Dr. Wilmore became Presbyterian himself. And you have to remember, this is the guy who later wrote the book Black and Presbyterian. Right? Gayraud Wilmore grew up in North Philadelphia in the 1920s and 1930s in a low-income Black neighborhood during the Great Migration, when many African Americans were moving from the South to northern cities, a migration that then led to a lot of white flight, white people moving out of those cities to the suburbs because they didn't want to live near Black people. And when those white people left, they vacated some of their old church buildings. Wilmore's father, who was actually Gayraud Wilmore Sr., he was a prominent community leader and activist, and he and a friend named John Rice had founded a community organization called the North Philadelphia Civic League. And one day, they were prominent community members, and one day some white Presbyterian officials approached these two community leaders and said, you all can have this church building right here on this street corner, a 500-person capacity church building. It has a gym, it has a bowling alley, has 15 classrooms. We'll just give it to you on the condition that you form a new Presbyterian congregation in that building. And that was because the white people had left this church and gone to the suburbs, and they didn't know what to do with this church. And they agreed. And those two families became Presbyterian overnight. And all of the officers of the North Philadelphia Civic League all became elders in this church. And they formed and created what was known as the McDowell Community Presbyterian Church. And they sometimes refer to it informally as the North Philadelphia Civic League at its knees. And lots of other Black folks in the area, some of them Presbyterian, but many of them who had been Baptist or Methodist, they joined this Presbyterian church as well. And the younger Gayraud Wilmore was about 15 years old at the time. So that's how he became Presbyterian. This might seem like a really odd, idiosyncratic story, but the same thing happened elsewhere because of the same dynamics of the Great Migration and white flight. This is how St. Augustine Presbyterian in the Bronx was founded under Edler Hawkins, who would later become the first Black moderator, which was like president of the Presbyterian Church. It's also how the Church of the Master was founded in Harlem under James Robinson. So these were three really major, large Black Presbyterian churches founded within 1 year of each other in 1937 and 38, all of them in buildings vacated by white Presbyterian congregations who were fleeing to the suburbs. So that's how Gayraud Wilmore becomes Presbyterian, would go on to become one of the most influential Presbyterians, period, in the past century. So, let me unpack these implications a little bit, right? Black Presbyterians, perhaps like Black United Methodists or Black Episcopalians, are sometimes assumed to be social climbers, right? Based on a sense or a prejudice or a stereotype that Black people become Presbyterian to gain access to material benefits, such as these church buildings or access to college education through all these Presbyterian institutions. There's sort of an allegation that as some African Americans rose up historically, economically, perhaps they wanted to distance themselves from traditions that are stereotyped as those of working class Black people, namely Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal traditions. Now, historically speaking, there was some truth to those dynamics in certain periods. And one of those periods is the Great Migration, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, when lots of African Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities, fleeing Jim Crow, looking for a new way of life. And sometimes they took on a new religious identity as well, one that perhaps to them signified a rise in social status or a hoped for rise in social status, distancing themselves from their roots in Baptist and Methodist traditions that perhaps were associated for them with the past, with a painful past, with the South, with slavery, and with a lower social class. And there is some classism here, clearly. There were also some people like this who became Catholic because they saw Catholic worship as more dignified, right? Which is classist, right? Bear with me here for a minute. This is really hard for us to imagine these days. And there's certainly some problematic things going on here. But to understand these dynamics, we have to remember some things about how people in this era, not just white people, thought about race and class and identity. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, there was a sense among a lot of African Americans that the way to gain equality was basically to act stereotypically white, to try to dress like white people, talk like white people, sort of be assimilated into white culture so they could be accepted into white culture, which white culture was seen as synonymous with American culture. And this it seems kind of nuts right now, right? But part of this was because they had seen this strategy work for some other groups. Irish, Jews, and other European immigrants who came here were at first seen as foreigners or even seen as non-white, and had gradually been able to gain acceptance into something like whiteness or Americanness over time. And it wasn't really until about the 1960s that most black people really gave up on this idea of assimilation. And that's why with Black Power, you start to hear more about Black pride, Black is beautiful, I'm Black and I'm proud, and so forth, embracing Blackness and Black culture. Anyway, all that is to say that social class and assimilation played a role here. And part of that is about access to education. But that's not all of it. I mean, there were also African Americans who became or stayed Presbyterian as a way to take the tools of the master, the tools of the enslaver, and use it against them, or at least use it for the benefit of the Black community in the form of education and other institutions. And that's really what part of what I see going on with McDowell Church in Philadelphia. What might look like social climbing might be more like strategic infiltration. With McDowell Church, the context makes clear that the Black founders of this church, they were already committed to supporting and advocating for the Black community. And gaining resources from the white church was not a way for these founders to kind of get ahead as individuals. It was a way to leverage white resources for the good of Black people. Okay, so, social class and also kind of strategically using white institutions. Also, I think though, and this is something that gets missed sometimes, is that education is a theological value. And it's one that's shared by white and Black Presbyterians. White Presbyterians believe in education, and college education, having learned clergy and learning the original languages having their clergy learn the original languages for the Bible and all this kind of stuff. And I think that some Black Christians who especially valued education theologically, that partly they made a theological decision to become Presbyterian and therefore to get access to college scholarships and a kind of access to literacy and learning. And again, that might look like social mobility, but it might also be a theological value. Okay. You'll recall that Presbyterians founded lots of Black Presbyterian schools and HBCUs, particularly in the South after the Civil War. And that comes from the Presbyterian tradition. And actually some of the most prominent Black Presbyterian leaders, especially in the North, became Presbyterian specifically because some white Presbyterian pastor pointed out to them that if they became Presbyterian, they could get a college scholarship or a seminary degree. There were these different pathways for people to do that. That was true for James Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, one of the most prominent 20th century Black Presbyterians, pastor of this major Black church in New York City. A white pastor told him, if you become Presbyterian, you can go to college and we'll pay for it. And he said, okay, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but it may well have been just as much theological as it was, personal or anything else. There's also, when you talk about education, there's a certain kind of subversiveness that comes with education among Black people in the United States. And we'll go back a little bit earlier to illustrate this. The Reverend John Chavis, the first Black Presbyterian missionary, worked in North Carolina in the early 1800s. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he was the first Black person to attend college in the United States. He went to Princeton. And much of what he did in his ministry was education, schooling for Black and white people. He ran one of the best schools in the state in a time when it was often illegal or seen as unacceptable to teach enslaved people to read. And ultimately, his ministry was shut down because of white fear after Nat Turner's rebellion, which was just a couple of counties away in southeastern Virginia, and was led by a well-educated Black minister. White people were really afraid of Black schools and Black ministers, and the state actually passed a law that forbade Black people to preach. And that was the end of Chavis's ministry. He couldn't preach anymore and his school got shut down. So Black education in itself it has often been subversive in the United States. In addition to all these Presbyterian HBCUs, there were also 2 Black Presbyterian seminaries, and those deserve special mention here, both of them were attached to Black Presbyterian universities. Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. Also, it included a seminary. In the late 50s, there was an ecumenical effort to form an association of historically Black seminaries from different denominations in Atlanta, and that became ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center. And in 1969, Smith Seminary left Smith University from Charlotte and went to Atlanta to go join that association. So that's Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary. And it's since gone on its own and split away from that group. But that, that was the major, still the major Black Presbyterian seminary in the South. The other historically Black seminary was the Theological Seminary of Lincoln University in southeastern Pennsylvania. Lincoln is one of the oldest HBCUs, arguably the oldest. It was the first degree granting HBCU in the United States. It was a Presbyterian HBCU and had a theological seminary. And so basically for a century, you had one Black Presbyterian seminary in the South and one in the North. And remember, both of them basically served the same denomination. And so, the Northern and Black Presbyterian denomination, the United Presbyterians. Lincoln University closed its seminary in the late 1950s, partly because they were moving towards becoming a state school, and so that was a problem for them. But also because this was the beginning of the desegregation of the historically white seminaries, and so Black students start going to these white majority seminaries. And there was also a sort of an embarrassment at that time among Black Christians about having all Black institutions. Like if we're trying to call white people to desegregate everything, we should also not have Black institutions. And there was really, frankly, sort of a naive optimism that white people were all right about to stop discriminating and integrate everything. And so some of these Black Presbyterians later regretted doing away with some of these institutions, especially when you get to the Black Power era in the late 60s, and it becomes clear that white people in white institutions are just as racist as they'd ever been, and that there's still a huge need for institutions and organizations by and for Black people. So, it's notable that Lincoln's seminary closed in the late 50s, a time of really more of an emphasis on, in that era, well, okay, we're Black Presbyterians, but the main thing is that we're Presbyterians, not so much that we're Black. And then about 10 years later, in the Black Power era, that's when Smith Seminary leaves Charlotte to Atlanta and sort of gets rejuvenated there. And that's at a point where people might have said, okay, we're Black Presbyterians, but the main thing is that we're Black, not so much that we're Presbyterians. So there's a shift in emphasis right there that happens with civil rights and Black power to emphasize Blackness instead of to kind of hide it or see it as less significant. Seminaries. There are also some Black caucuses that we need to talk about, Black church caucuses. I talked about how the vast majority of Black Presbyterian churches were affiliated with the United Presbyterian Church, the Northern Church. So in the South, what that meant was that Black Presbyterian churches basically only dealt with other Black Presbyterian churches in their regional meetings, because white Southern Presbyterians were in a totally different denomination. And what this meant was that, we think of Black Presbyterians as part of a majority white denomination, but it really didn't feel like that at all in the South for about a century, because it was almost like there was this entire, almost all Black denomination, the Southern Black Presbyterian denomination. It was sort of connected to the Northern Church, but it was in the South, it was kind of its own thing. And part of what that meant was there were lots of opportunity for solidarity and community among Black Presbyterians, similar to how it might be for AME Church or AME Zion or CME. Because you go to your regional gatherings and everybody's there, right? It was a totally different situation for Black Presbyterians in the North, because there Black people were always in the minority at presbyteries and synods and regional gatherings. So when you're in the minority, particularly if you're Black in America, what do? You form caucuses or associations, groups for solidarity and community and mutual support. Some of those caucuses started informally as early as 1856, right before the Civil War. But the formal beginning of what was basically a Northern Black Presbyterian organization within the broader denomination started in 1894 with pastors Francis Grimke, R.H. Armstrong, Matthew Anderson, and John B. Reeve, who met at First African Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia to formalize the creation of what they called the Colored Presbyterian Council of Ministers and Elders in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Kind of a long organizational name. Pretty quickly, they changed their name to become the Afro-American Presbyterian Council. And they were that for about 50 years. In 1947, again, when we're starting to move toward the civil rights era, and African Americans start to become nervous about having overtly racial language in their groups because they want white people to stop having particularly racial groups, right? So they drop the Afro-American part from the name and they become the Council of the North and West, or the Presbyterian Council of the North and West. Why the North and West? Because all of the Black Presbyterians in the South were in these all Black presbyteries. So Black Presbyterians not in the South were in the North and the West. So they were in majority white presbyteries and synods. And so they were the ones that needed this caucus organization for solidarity and mutual support. So that's why the name. So it's a source of solidarity and community. The Council of the North and West was also a really important political pressure group within the denomination. And the same is true of these Southern Black synods and presbyteries. Sort of like a denomination within a denomination. These organizations weren't eligible, or weren't able to be voted to be, kind of president kind of things in the church, or officers for the denomination as a whole. So there are these other, avenues for leadership. Now, I talked about the kind of naivete or optimism in the late 50s that caused one of the Black seminaries to close. And the same thing happened with this Black church caucus. In 1957, the caucus voted to disband because it thought it was no longer needed because we were all headed towards an era of integration. 6 years later, 1963, they realized this was a mistake and they reorganized again, and they took the name Concerned Presbyterians under Bryant George and Edler Hawkins. But no, they were still uncomfortable having anything like Black or African American in the name. They still wanted to be kind of a race neutral name. So that's why they said Concerned Presbyterians. A couple of years later, there was no more uncomfortability about that. We're now in the era of Black power and Black pride and Black theology. And people switched from using the term Negro to using the term Black. And so they renamed and reorganized the group under Edler Hawkins, Tony Butts, and Thelma Adair as Black Presbyterians United, or BPU, Black Presbyterians United. And this was an era of lots of other denominations started having or had reinvigorated Black caucuses in majority white denominations. And the two major Presbyterian denominations reunited in the 1980s and 1983. And at that point, BPU merged with another group and they became the National Black Presbyterian Caucus, which is still the name that it has today. So that's kind of the history of these Black caucuses in the Presbyterian Church. Now, I want to say a few things about Gayraud Wilmore in the era of the civil rights movement and Black power and Black theology, because that's the center of my research. You already heard about how Wilmore became Presbyterian in Philadelphia in the 30s. He served in combat in Italy in World War II. Now, after the war, he went to college and seminary at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And there he and lots of other Lincoln students started becoming involved in sit-ins. Now we think of sit-ins as starting around 1960 in places like Greensboro and Nashville and Raleigh. But these young Black mostly Presbyterian college students and seminarians were doing sit-ins in Pennsylvania as early as 1947. These were not the first sit-ins, but they were some of the first. They were trying to desegregate restaurants and movie theaters in this rural Pennsylvania, Jim Crow kind of a town. So, civil rights historians will argue about, when did the civil rights movement really begin? Did it start with the Montgomery bus boycott or some other helping get the civil rights movement started? So Wilmore went to school there. He was a valedictorian in college and in seminary. He was a pastor in the Philadelphia suburbs where he helped desegregate his son's elementary school. He was the first Black staffer in the social action office of the Presbyterian Church. He was the first Black professor at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And then in 1963, the Presbyterian Church felt really convicted by the civil rights movement, specifically the Birmingham campaign led by Dr. King. And it was also facing a lot of internal pressure from Black Presbyterians who were demanding action. Remember, that was the year that this Black caucus was recreated after having been disbanded. And so the United Presbyterian Church became the first majority white denomination to create an agency focused on racial justice, which was called the Committee on Religion and Race. And they chose Wilmore to be the executive director of this organization, and he was that for about a decade. He was at all the big marches in the civil rights movement. He helped to guide the church. Really, a lot of it was in contributing money to all these different civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Also in promoting voter registration in Mississippi, and in lobbying for passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. These were things that the Presbyterian, racial justice group, pushed the whole denomination to do these things. The church actually paid the salary every year for one of Dr. King's staffers in the SCLC, Hosea Williams. And if you know about Hosea Williams, it's most likely because he's the one walking right next to John Lewis when the two of them lead the Selma March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But he was on the Presbyterian Church's payroll to do that. So that was part of what Wilmore did. One interesting thing that I found in my research was a key connection between the Reformed tradition and the creation of Black theology. Now, sometimes people talk about, Black theology, Black liberation theology to kind of talk about all kind of progressive Black American Christian theology going back, people like Nat Turner or Frederick Douglass or something. And I actually argue that Gayraud Wilmore is the one who coined the term Black theology and was the person most responsible for kind of coming up with this basic idea, which essentially James Cone then kind of worked more on and popularized more. But that Wilmore, in doing this, was actually drawing on the Reformed tradition to do this. Okay. In the late 50s and early 60s, Gayraud Wilmore had been on a committee to create a new book of confessions for his denomination. Before that, they'd had one confession, the Westminster Confession, and they decided to create a book to collect a whole bunch of different creeds and confessions from church history and write a new one to address contemporary issues like civil rights. And Wilmore was on this committee. He wrote the initial draft of the passages that talked about racism in the confession. So this was an important step for the church to take, right? But it was also pretty inadequate, pretty paternalistic. This is most obvious when you look at the committee itself. There were 15 people on the committee, 13 white guys, one white woman, and one African-American man, Gayraud Wilmore. So, they made important contributions, but they were treated as tokens, really, Wilmore and the woman on the committee. A couple of years later, in June 1966, the Black Power movement begins with the Memphis to Jackson March Against Fear. And there's a transition that happens here. So this is a And here, Gayraud Wilmore, starting in 1966, works with several others to develop a Black Christian response to this new idea of Black power. And they create an organization called the National Committee of Black Churchmen, the NCBC. And they released this new group's first public statement as a Christian endorsement of Black power in a full-page ad in the New York Times. This is an ecumenical group, 48 signatories from several denominations, a lot of Northern Black clergy from majority white denominations, but also AME Zion folks, Baptists. And they thought of themselves as kind of a more radical Northern SCLC. Again, trying to figure out a Christian basis for Black power. Wilmore was the head of this group's theological commission, which meant that he was the one who actually wrote most of its public statements. Wilmore was still executive director of the Presbyterian Racial Justice Agency, but he got his second in command, Black Presbyterian minister Metz Rollins, to switch over and to become the full-time executive director of this new organization. And the Presbyterian Church continued to pay his salary. So the Presbyterian Church was now paying the salary of Hosea Williams with the SCLC and a Metz Rollins as the director of the most significant ecumenical Christian Black power organization. So that's pretty cool. The term Black theology also seems to have arisen from this new group's discourse during the year 1968 in a report by Gayraud Wilmore for the group's Theological Commission. He wrote that the commission had been working to bring Black scholars together, quote, on a few key questions in the current discussion. And he said that there was a feeling and so those are the first two written references ever, at least that we know of, to the term Black theology. And both times he puts the term in quotes, indicating, that it's a new idea. Right? Now, Wilmore never claimed to have invented the term. What may have happened was that it came into use in conversation among these Black pastors and scholars sort of organically. But it could be that he was the one who chose these words to encapsulate kind of a set of ideas swirling among his associates. But either way, it's the first known use of that term in print by somebody supportive of Black theology. And it's also of note here that actually the term womanist theology also comes from Black Presbyterians. The term womanist was popularized by the novelist Alice Walker, but the term womanist theology was first used by the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. Katie Cannon was from Kannapolis, North Carolina, from a proud heritage of Southern Black Presbyterians from the Catawba Synod. She was one of the first Black women to earn a PhD from a theological school and one of the most influential theologians of the past century period. One of the founders of womanist theology, which is a form of theology by and for Black women or women of color. And she was also the first Black woman ever ordained as a Presbyterian minister. So, therefore, Black Presbyterians deserve credit for giving us both Black theology and womanist theology, certainly the terms for these movements, as well as some of the key ideas by these two figures. There's one other piece of the story of the origins of Black theology, and it's the way that Black theology arose in a way out of the Reformed tradition. We already talked about Wilmore's role with the Presbyterian Confession Committee, and Wilmore kind of left that committee pretty unhappy with its process, even though he'd made some important contributions to it. But he was kind of reacting against the Reformed tradition at that time, or at least against the Reformed tradition as seen through the lens of white men, right? But even as he was walking away from, he still, was an official with the Reformed tradition, but he was kind of walking away from, disenchanted with some aspects of the Reformed tradition. He was also drawing on that tradition in other ways. And in fact, I think it's reasonable to see the National Conference of Black Churchmen and Black theology at least in some respects, not a rejection of within the Reformed tradition, within Presbyterianism. And for Wilmore, I think that in creating the statements of the National Conference of Black Churchmen, he was actually sort of creating his own version of a book of confessions and directly drawing on some Reformed tradition documents in creating Black theology. The most intriguing evidence of this is his reference to the Theological Declaration of Barmen in his 1968 report. The Barmen Declaration was an anti-Nazi statement by Reformed churches in 1930s Germany, and it was one of the documents in this new book of confessions. And the Barmen Declaration arose from a situation known as a status confessionis, which is a term in Reformed theology which refers to a dire situation, a serious crisis when one must draw a line in the sand by writing a confession. The denomination's new confession created by these 14 white people and Gayraud Wilmore, it wasn't this kind of confession. It was dealing with some different issues, but it didn't see itself as responding to a major crisis. And that was Wilmore's problem with it. He did think there was a dire, serious crisis going on that the church had to speak out about, and that was the crisis of racism in America. And so, he writes in his report that he wanted to create some kind of a Barmen Declaration for Black churchmen in the face of the repressive and genocidal racism of American society, as he described it. And he said, we're working theological I think we can sort of then of Presbyterians of the Reformed tradition, such that Black theology, or at least this form of it, was a development within the Reformed tradition, within Presbyterianism. So again, we think about it's a Black Presbyterian faith tradition, not just Black people who happen to be Presbyterian, but there is a tradition here. Right. For slavery. In that year, James Forman, a Black power leader, released the Black Manifesto, demanding that the nation's white churches and synagogues pay $500 million in reparations due to their past complicity in slavery and discrimination. And he publicized it through lots of dramatic protests at the headquarters of different denominations and at Riverside Church in New York City. Forman didn't get very far in most denominations with this proposal, but a lot of Black ministers in majority white denominations like the Presbyterian Church were pretty enthusiastic about it. And because of pressure from these Black Presbyterian leaders, the United Presbyterian Church, unlike almost every other denomination, agreed to meet some of these demands. The church dedicated $100,000 to a relief organization connected to James Forman and promised to eventually raise another $50 million to be used in depressed areas, is what they said. And so the next year, in 19... Presbyterians, the church created an economic empowerment program called the Program for the Self-Development of People. This program has provided millions of dollars in community development grants in poor communities, allowing members of those communities to manage the funds themselves based on the principle of self-determination from the Black Power movement, as a reaction against paternalism. And this program, Self-Development of People, is actually still around today and disperses several $100,000 every year, relying on an offering taken up once a year in Presbyterian congregations called the One Great Hour of Sharing offering, which just happened recently. It's usually taken up around Palm Sunday or Easter. It's debatable whether we want to refer to this as reparations for a whole host of reasons. Among them, the grants are based on social class, not race. The denomination doesn't use the term reparations, so most people, when they put their money in the plate, they think of it as just another charitable gift rather than paying a debt or paying back pay, right? But it's an interesting and meaningful effort that comes directly from Black Presbyterians pushing for reparations in a really unique way in the Black Power era. Okay, so that's the Black Power era. A little after that, in 1983, the two denominations merge. The Northern and Black denomination, the United Presbyterian Church, merges with the Southern White denomination, the PCUS, to form the PCUSA, which is what we have today. They referred to this as reunion because it was basically the reunification of American Presbyterians after they'd been divided by the Civil War. Not everybody was thrilled about being part of this reunion. Most notably, the most conservative of the Southern White congregations, the ones that had been the staunchest supporters of segregation and racist policies, broke away in the early 70s. They could see the writing was on the wall to form their own denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America, or the PCA. They saw the church, the PCUS, by joining with the Northern Church, they saw it as betraying its pro-Confederate roots. And when they organized, they in the 1973, they explicitly honored Confederate figures and their official founding and kind of styled themselves in that way. Some other churches later joined the PCA that didn't necessarily share its explicit racism, and they were more concerned about things like fighting against women's ordination, women's equality in terms of ordination. And the PCA did, later back away from explicit racism, but it has remained opposed to women's equality in terms of ordination. And also, in the past decade, a significant number of churches have left the PCUSA because of homophobia, because they object to the PCUSA's support for marriage equality and ordination of LGBTQ plus persons. And so that basically gets us to the current grouping, which is a national denomination, Northern and Southern. And in the South, there are presbyteries, the result of these mergers of all white presbyteries and all Black presbyteries. That's a positive development in some ways because it's a kind of a desegregation, but there are also some costs. There's a loss of Black political clout in the church and a loss of some forms of Black church community. And there are parallels there to some of the things lost in desegregation, right? Obviously, a lot of great things about desegregating schools and so forth, but you lose these Black schools led by Black principals and Black teachers that are kind of centers of the community. So there's some drawbacks and some regrets that folks have about this, but that's where we are now. Anyway, that's enough for me to say here. Clearly, again, this is not comprehensive history of Black Presbyterians. I'm sure I left a lot of folks out and movements out, but I hope that gives or not of what are some of the distinctive features and historical movements and figures from the Black Presbyterian tradition, a church within a church, a Black church space, which is also a part of a majority white denomination with a really strong tradition of education, and also prophetic witness for racial and social justice. Thanks, and I'm ready to take any questions that folks have now. You can, I guess, put them in the chat or something if you haven't already.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Appreciate it. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Before we go to questions, just want to remind folks who are attending this evening, our next and final Edwards Peacemaking lecture for the year will take place on April the 26th at 7 p.m. Reverend Dr. Teresa L. Fry Brown will deliver her presentation, The Church of Allen, Tending Our Own Vine and Fig Tree, and that will be about the AME Church If you look in the chat, I included information about that, the day and the time, as well as the link to register. And we certainly hope you can join us for that. Moving on to questions for Dr. Clark. If you have a question for Dr. Clark, you may submit that in the chat box or the Q&A function. I'll scroll through here and see what we've received so far. Here we go. Dr. Clark, from David Diedrich, was the community for which Wilmore drafted the racial component, was that the community writing the Confession of 76?
Yeah, of 67, the Confession of 1967. That's right. They prior to that, there was one confession, the Westminster Confession, and they decided, you know, one of the things about confessions is they come from a particular time and place. They have a context to them. And so maybe we should create a new one to reflect this, the Confession of 1967, but they worked on it for 10 years before that. So it reflects
Dr. Clark, you froze up there for a little bit. Your bandwidth might be running low. If you could wrap that last thought up real quick. I think it was the last 10, 15 seconds or so.
been working on it for about 10 years before that. So partly it reflected ideas from the early 60s and late 50s. And that kind of made it a little out of balance with the era of the Black Power era when it came out. It was because it was a little more moderate.
All righty. Next question from Polly Williams. How does this history speak to evangelism for both those of European origin as well as BIPOC?
Evangelism. Good question. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's this missions history, which includes, you know, foreign missions as well as domestic missions. It includes folks coming down from the north, you know, carpetbaggers or whatever, right? The northern churches coming down and spreading religious ideas and also religious resources in the forms of churches and schools. And it also, you know, there's some cautionary stuff here about the failures of Presbyterians in the early 1800s in terms of to not grow, particularly among African Americans. And part of that had to do with not having a strong social witness or anti-racist witness, and also some of the limits involved in, you know, requiring theological education and just sort of being out of step with the times there. So that's a couple of the lessons there.
Excellent. Next question is from Laura Duke. Laura says, you mentioned desegregation has some drawbacks. What do you see as the ideal? Desegregation or maintaining the status quo, or something yet unexplored?
I mean, I don't really know that there's like a silver bullet here. You know, I mean, one of the problems one of the problems that Black Power folks thought about integration was that basically it meant, you know, it was integration on white people's terms. And so, you know, your kids might be in school with white people, but you know, white folks were in charge of the institution, and so that's was a problem whenever you have. So, you know, shared power is really important, but also there's a sense that, you know, sometimes people will, you know, some of my white students will be, you know, surprised by why is there, you know, why is there a Black church? Why do Black people want to segregate themselves, right? But it's like that reflects this history that the Black church has been a place of refuge from a hostile white society, which we still have a hostile white society, right? And so, you know, there are some reasons to have spaces that are insulated from white people and from those kinds of things. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet, but, you know, just kind of having token integration was part of the problem there. And
Alrighty. And Dr. Clark, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier in your presentation, but just to be sure we have all the bases covered. What is the Presbyterian Church's stance in reference to reparations for Black Americans?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they have a particular stance right now. I mean, the so much of that is changing because reparations has in the Presbyterian Church right now, but yeah, I imagine there's probably a lot of conversation about that, and there's an awareness that this self-development of people, it's kind of a reparations, and it's one that the church has kind of hid from in some ways because they don't use the language of reparations because they're worried people then aren't going to donate money if they think it's reparations, which maybe they won't. But maybe it's a question is like maybe we should just call it that, and because maybe that's more palatable now because there's more openness to it in the wider society.
All right, next question from Graham Renfro. It is hard not to escape the interplay between politics and religious action throughout your presentation. In light of current actions taken in various states, what is the best lens through which the practicing Presbyterian can interpret these laws and their impact in their personal ministry?
Great question, Graham. What's the best lens for practice laws, their impact in their personal ministry? Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of lessons here, and the lesson that I want to, in thinking about politics and religion, is the Reformed tradition teaches that there is not a separation in the sense there are not issues that are just political issues and that are not relevant to the church. That's been the tradition. Clearly, there were white Southern Presbyterians who tried to totally reverse that, and really, that's a thing that is characteristic of American white culture in general, and specifically Southern white American religion. Is this religion and politics should be separate, and it really comes from this embarrassment about slavery and a conscious, we think that white people in the 1800s had no idea slavery was wrong. No, they knew it was wrong, and they had to figure out all these ways to rationalize it for themselves and figure out how they could live with it. And one of the ways they lived with it was they said, well, it's a political issue. We don't care about political issues. We care about saving souls. And so that's something we always have to watch out for. And we need to be involved in things. It sounds like you're probably talking about voting rights in Georgia, right? And we certainly need to be involved in that as a denomination.
All right. If anyone has any more questions, we'll go ahead and take them now. But it looks like we have fielded all the ones that we have submitted so far. Dr. Clark, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation this evening. Thank you for participating in our Edwards Lecture Series. Again, for those who attended, don't forget to register for our April 26th Edwards Lecture at 7 p.m. And before we say goodbye for the evening, I'd like to ask Dr. Clark to close us out with a prayer.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for fielding the questions and hosting us here tonight. And thanks everybody for showing up and participating and listening and asking questions. Please pray with me. Holy God, thank you for this time together this evening, this time to learn and share and commune with one another. Thank you for the wonderful gift that we are celebrating this evening, that is the witness of the Black Presbyterian tradition that has blessed this nation and world with its commitment to racial and social justice and to education. Thank you for the witness of courageous and insightful saints, the historical figures discussed this evening, and particularly for the witness of those two titans of the faith who've left us recently, the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon and the Reverend Dr. Gayraud Wilmore. Thank you also for the ongoing witness of Black Presbyterians from our stated clerk, J. Herbert Nelson, and the presidents of our seminaries like Alton Pollard, to all those everyday folks in the pews. Thank you for the spirit of ecumenical solidarity that allows us to collaborate through these lectures and through the Nehemiah Project among Presbyterians, United Methodists, AME Zion, CME, and others. God, grant us wisdom, discernment, and courage that we might continue to work together to draw lessons from these denominational histories for the benefit of contemporary Black congregations and for racial justice throughout this nation, even in these challenging days, as we groan and travail together for justice. Lord, I also ask your special care this evening for all those families hurting today as a result of police violence, particularly those in the Minneapolis area, the family of George Floyd and that of Dante Wright, and as always for the family of Breonna Taylor and for all those who face the threat of police violence or other forms of racism every day in this country. May all have comfort and peace as well as justice. I pray these things in Jesus' name, and others pray in other names. Amen.
Amen indeed. Amen indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. And thanks again to all of you for joining us this evening. And we will see you next time.